The wind howled across the Texas plains carrying dust and whispered promises as Harper Wells crouched behind a weathered barn, counting the coins in her trembling palm. $5.37, all that remained from her desperate flight west. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Simmons Ranch, a sprawling kingdom of cattle and horses that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of grass and possibility. Harper adjusted the oversized hat that concealed her cropped hair, wincing as the brim brushed against the purple bruise flowering around her left eye. She'd cut her chestnut locks with a rusty blade the night she fled Kentucky, each severed strand a declaration of freedom from a life that had suffocated her since birth. Now, standing at the edge of the Simmons property, she rehearsed her story one final time. Henry Wells, 20, orphaned, good, with horses, looking for honest work. The ranch house loomed ahead, a two-story structure of weathered wood and quiet dignity. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of bacon and coffee that made Harper's empty stomach clench in protest. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Her fingers unconsciously traced the outline of her chest, making sure the tight binding was secure beneath her threadbare shirt. One mistake, one loose piece of fabric, and everything would collapse. Harper's boots crunched on the gravel as she approached the main house, each step carrying the weight of her deception. But it wasn't just the fear of discovery that haunted her. It was the flickering images that visited her dreams. The burning barn in Kentucky, her younger brother's screams, the accusation in her father's eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the memories back into the darkened corners of her mind. "You lost, boy." The voice sliced through her thoughts like a blade. Harper's head snapped up to find a man standing on the porch, his frame silhouetted against the morning light. Mason Simmons was not what she expected. The rumors in town had painted him as a giant, a hard man carved from the very rocks that dotted his land. But the figure before her was lean and weathered, with eyes the color of a winter sky, not frightening so much as watchful, like a hawk surveying its territory. "Oh, see," Harper replied, deepening her voice to the practiced rumble she'd perfected on her journey west. "Looking for work, if you're hiring." Mason descended the steps, his boots striking the earth with deliberate purpose. He circled Harper slowly, measuring her with a gaze that seemed to strip away layers. "You've worked ranches before." "Yes, sir. Good with horses. Can mend fences, brand cattle." Harper stood straighter, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite the hammering of her heart. "I don't shy from hard work." A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed Mason's face. "You're what? 17, 20, sir," Harper corrected firmly, adding 2 years to her true age of 18. Better to seem older, more capable. Mason's eyes lingered on the bruise marring her face, but asked no questions. Instead, he nodded toward the stable. "We lost a hand last week. Moved to California with dreams of gold in his eyes." He spat on the ground. "Fool's errand. Ranch needs steady men, not dreamers." Harper felt a faint ember of hope ignite in her chest. "I'm steady." "We'll see." Mason turned and started toward the barn. "Bunkhouse is behind the main stable. Find Rufus. He'll show you where to put your things. Breakfast is in 20 minutes. After that, we work." Harper watched his retreating back, scarcely believing her luck. But as the initial relief faded, the weight of her deception settled more heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just lying about her name. She was denying the very essence of who she was. Yet what choice did she have? In a world that had no place for girls who refused dresses and marriage proposals, who preferred the company of horses to suitors, sometimes a lie was the only path to survival. The bunkhouse was a long, low building that smelled of sweat tobacco and unwashed bodies. Harper's nose wrinkled as she stepped inside, finding herself under the scrutiny of half a dozen men lounging on narrow cots. "Fresh meat," one of them commented, a burly man with a beard that seemed to devour his face. An older man with skin like tanned leather rose from a chair in the corner. This must be Rufus, the ranch foreman Harper had heard whispers about in town. His eyes, one blue, one brown, fixed on Harper with unsettling intensity. "Name's Rufus Johnson," he said, voice rough as sandpaper. "And you'd be Henry Wells." Harper extended her hand, praying it wouldn't shake. Rufus's grip was firm, his palm calloused from decades of ranch work. "You ever broke horses before, boy?" Harper nodded. "Since I was 14. A smile creased Rufus's weathered face. "Good. We got 3 Mustangs need taming." He pointed to an empty cot at the far end of the room. "That's yours. Keep it tidy. Keep your business to yourself, and we'll get along fine." Harper nodded her thanks and moved toward the cot, feeling the eyes of the other ranch hands following her. She set down her meager possessions, a spare shirt, a small knife, a frayed photograph of her mother, and sat on the edge of the thin mattress. The photograph she quickly tucked beneath the pillow out of sight. Her mother's kind eyes were too painful to look at now. A reminder of gentler days before disease took her, leaving Harper alone with a father who saw his daughter as property to be married off at the first opportunity. Breakfast was a boisterous affair in the main house, with ranch hands crowded around a long oak table laden with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Harper ate ravenously, though carefully maintaining her disguise, sitting with legs apart, elbows on the table, speaking only when necessary in her practiced, deeper voice. Mason sat at the head of the table, mostly silent, occasionally giving instructions to Rufus about the day's work. His gaze fell on Harper more than once, his expression unreadable. Did he suspect? Was there something in her mannerisms that betrayed her? Harper forced herself to eat slower to mimic the movements of the men around her. After breakfast, work began in earnest. Harper was assigned to help mend a broken section of fence on the north pasture, working alongside a taciturn cowboy named Frank, who spoke little but worked with efficient precision. The labor was grueling under the Texas sun, but Harper welcomed it. Physical exhaustion left little room for memories or fears. Days melted into weeks. Harper rose before dawn, worked until dusk, and collapsed into her cot each night, with muscles screaming in protest. She became adept at maintaining her disguise, bathing in the creek only in the darkest hours of night, binding her chest so tightly she sometimes struggled to breathe, adopting the coarse language and mannerisms of the men around her. The bruise on her face faded, replaced by a deepening tan, and new calluses on her once smooth hands. The nightmares, however, persisted. In the quiet darkness of the bunkhouse, while other men snored around her, Harper would jerk awake, her brother's screams echoing in her ears, the smell of smoke filling her nostrils. On those nights, she would slip outside and sit beneath the vast canopy of Texas stars, reminding herself that she was far from Kentucky, far from the father who had beaten her and the community that had turned its back. It was during one such night that Mason found her. Harper sat on a fallen log behind the stable, her face tilted up to the moonlight, when the crunch of boots on gravel alerted her to his presence. She scrambled to her feet, hastily adjusting her posture to maintain her disguise. "Trouble sleeping?" Mason asked, offering her a cigarette, which she declined with a shake of her head. "Just getting some air, sir." Harper kept her voice low, careful. Mason lit his own cigarette, the ember glowing orange in the darkness. "You've done good work these past weeks," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Rufus says you've got away with the horses, even that mean stallion we brought in last month." Harper felt a flutter of pride. The stallion, a magnificent black beast with eyes like burning coal, had been deemed untamable by 3 other ranch hands. But Harper had approached him differently, with patience rather than force, speaking to him in soft tones until he allowed her to stroke his velvet nose. "Thank you, sir." Mason studied her in the moonlight. "You running from something, Wells?" The question struck like a physical blow. Harper struggled to keep her expression neutral. "Sir, most men come west for a reason. Gold land opportunity." Mason took another drag of his cigarette. "Some come running from the law, others from things worse than the law." Harper swallowed hard. "Just looking for honest work, sir." Mason nodded slowly, though his eyes suggested he heard the lie beneath her words. "Well, you found it. Just remember, past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you run." With that cryptic warning, he retreated into the darkness, leaving Harper alone with the stars and her secrets. The summer heat intensified as July stretched into August. The land grew parched, the creek reduced to a trickle, the grass turning yellow beneath the relentless sun. Tension on the ranch mounted, with the mercury tempers flaring over minor disagreements, horses growing skittish, cattle lowing mournfully in the dusty pastures. It was during this drought that Harper's first true test came. She was in the stable, brushing down the black stallion she'd come to think of as her own, when she heard a commotion outside. Shouts, the pounding of boots on hard earth, and beneath it all, a sound that turned her blood to ice, the crackle of flames. Harper burst from the stable to find the hayloft ablaze, orange tongues licking at the dry wood, black smoke billowing into the cloudless sky. Men scrambled with buckets from the well, forming a chain that seemed pathetically inadequate against the growing inferno. The fire brought back the memories she'd tried so desperately to suppress: the Kentucky barn, the screams, the accusations. But this time was different. This time she wasn't frozen in fear. This time she could act. Without hesitation, Harper raced toward the burning structure. Rufus's voice cut through the chaos. "The horses! Get the horses out!" Inside the burning stable, panic reigned. Horses kicked at their stalls, eyes rolling wild with terror. The air grew thick with smoke, scorching Harper's lungs with each desperate breath. She moved down the row of stalls, flinging open gates, slapping flanks, guiding the frightened animals toward the safety of the yard. The roof groaned ominously overhead. Burning embers rained down one landing on Harper's shirt, searing through the fabric to the flesh beneath. She gasped in pain, slapping at the spark, feeling the binding around her chest loosen as the fabric tore. 5 horses freed, 3 remaining. The smoke grew denser, the heat unbearable. Harper pressed on, tears streaming from irritated eyes, handkerchief pressed to her mouth. She reached the stall of a young mare heavy with foal. The horse was paralyzed with fear, refusing to move despite Harper's urging. "Come on, girl," Harper pleaded, her voice raw. She grabbed the mare's halter, pulling with all her strength. "Please." A tremendous crack sounded overhead as a burning beam gave way. Harper looked up in horror as it plummeted toward her. A strong hand grabbed her collar, yanking her backward as the beam crashed to the spot where she'd stood seconds before. Mason's face, streaked with soot, appeared through the smoke. "We need to go," he shouted over the roar of the flames. "Now." "The mare," Harper protested. "She's in foal." Mason cursed, then pushed past Harper to the terrified horse. With a strength that belied his lean frame, he slapped the mare's flank hard, startling her into motion. Together, they guided the animal toward the exit, the 3 of them bursting into the blessed coolness of the yard, just as another section of roof collapsed behind them. Harper gulped clean air, doubled over with coughing. It was then she realized the state of her clothing, the torn shirt, the loosened binding. She straightened in panic, crossing her arms over her chest, but it was too late. Mason stood before her, his expression shifting from relief to confusion to dawning comprehension. Their eyes met over the chaos of the burning barn. Time seemed to suspend as understanding passed between them. Harper waited for the anger, the accusations, the order to leave. Instead, Mason shrugged out of his jacket and tossed it to her, his face unreadable. "Put this on," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Then help Rufus with the bucket line." Stunned, Harper pulled on the jacket which hung from her smaller frame like a tent. Mason turned away, barking orders to the other men, organizing efforts to contain the blaze before it could spread to other buildings. For hours they fought the fire until their arms ached and their throats burned from smoke and thirst. By nightfall, the danger had passed, leaving only smoldering ruins where the hayloft had stood. The ranch hands gathered in the yard exhausted, but relieved that no lives, human or animal, had been lost. Harper kept to the edges of the group, Mason's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her mind raced with possibilities. Would he expose her to the others? Force her to leave? Or worse, hand her over to the law as a fraud? A woman masquerading as a man? As the men dispersed to clean up before dinner, Mason caught her eye and jerked his head toward the main house. "My office," he said. "After breakfast tomorrow." That night was the longest of Harper's life. Sleep eluded her entirely as she lay in her cot, staring at the ceiling, planning escape routes and alternatives. She could leave before dawn, disappear into the vast Texas landscape. But where would she go? How would she survive? And the thought of abandoning the ranch, the horses, the fragile sense of belonging she'd begun to build, it cut deeper than she expected. By the time the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, Harper had made her decision. She would face Mason, accept whatever judgment came. It was perhaps time to stop running. Breakfast was a somber affair. The men, subdued after yesterday's close-call conversation, centered around repairs and precautions. Harper ate little, her stomach knotted with dread. When the others filed out to begin the day's work, she remained seated, waiting until the room cleared before rising and making her way to Mason's office at the back of the house. She knocked softly on the solid oak door. "Enter," came the reply. The office was smaller than Harper expected, dominated by a massive desk cluttered with ledgers and maps. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on agriculture, animal husbandry, and Texas law. Mason stood at the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the charred remains of the hayloft. "Sit down," he said, without turning. Harper lowered herself into a chair perched on the edge, ready to flee if necessary. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she was certain he could hear it. Mason turned, finally, his face grave as he studied her. "Your real name isn't Henry, is it?" Harper swallowed hard. "No, sir." "Then perhaps you should tell me who you really are." Mason settled into the chair behind his desk, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "Harper," she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue after months of disuse. "Harper Wells. And you're not a boy." It wasn't a question, but Harper shook her head anyway. "No, sir." Mason leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. Why the deception, Miss Wells? The formal address startled her. "Would you have hired me if I'd come, a woman?" A flicker of acknowledgement crossed his face. "Fair point, but that doesn't answer my question." Harper's hands twisted in her lap. How much should she reveal? How much could she trust this man who held her future in his weathered hands? "I had to leave Kentucky," she began, choosing her words carefully. "There was no place for someone like me there." Someone like you. Someone who... Harper struggled to articulate the disconnect she'd felt her entire life. The wrongness of frilly dresses and ladies' tea parties, the rightness of trousers and open skies. I never fit the mold of what a girl should be. My father tried to beat it out of me. When that failed, he arranged a marriage to a man twice my age who promised to tame me. Mason's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes softened. So you ran? Yes. But that wasn't the whole truth, and Harper knew it. The partial confession left a bitter taste in her mouth. There's more, she admitted, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. The night I left, there was a fire. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly. My father's tobacco barn. I was hiding there planning my escape when I knocked over a lantern. The words came faster now, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I tried to put it out, I swear I did, but it spread so quickly. My brother Samuel came looking for me. He got trapped inside. I got him out, but he was badly burned. Tears welled in Harper's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. My father said I did it on purpose, that I was unnatural, dangerous. He would have killed me if I'd stayed. She raised her gaze to meet Mason's, her chin lifting in defiance despite her tears. So yes, I ran. I became Henry, because a woman alone has few options, none of them good. Silence stretched between them as Mason absorbed her confession. Outside the normal sounds of the ranchmen calling to each other, horses nickering the distant lowing of cattle, continued oblivious to the drama unfolding within the office walls. Yesterday, Mason said finally, you ran into a burning building to save those horses. Harper nodded, unsure where he was leading. Most men wouldn't have done that. They'd have written off the animals as lost. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You have courage, Miss Wells. That's rare, regardless of whether you wear trousers or skirts. Hope fluttered in Harper's chest. Sir? Mason rose, moving to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, pouring a finger in each. He set one before Harper, who stared at it in confusion. I'm not in the business of turning away good workers, Miss Wells, and you are good with the horses, especially. He returned to his seat, lifting his own glass. I propose a compromise. You continue your work here, but no more deception between us. You tell me the truth always, and I'll keep your secret from the others. Harper's mouth fell open in shock. Of all the outcomes she'd imagined, this was never among them. You're not sending me away. Where would you go? Mason asked practically. Back to Kentucky, where your father waits, or to some town where you'd be forced into a life that doesn't fit you. He shook his head. No, I think you're better off here. The ranch needs skilled hands, and you've proven yourself these past months. Relief washed over Harper so intensely she felt lightheaded. Thank you, she whispered, lifting the whiskey with trembling fingers. The liquor burned a path down her throat, but the sensation was nothing compared to the warmth blooming in her chest at this unexpected reprieve. Mason drained his own glass, then leaned forward, his expression growing serious once more. There will be conditions, of course. You'll move out of the bunkhouse. There's a small cabin behind the main stable that was used by the previous foreman. It needs work, but it will give you privacy. Harper nodded eagerly. You'll continue to dress as you do. Now it's safer for everyone, and you've made it clear you're more comfortable this way. Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. But if anyone from your past comes looking, or if your presence here puts my ranch at risk, our arrangement ends. Understood? Yes, sir. Mason studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in her face. The fire yesterday, it brought back memories for you. It wasn't a question, but Harper nodded anyway, her throat tight. We all have ghosts, Miss Wells. Something dark and pained flashed across Mason's face, gone so quickly, Harper wondered if she'd imagined it. The trick is learning to live with them. He stood signaling the end of their conversation. Rufus will show you to the cabin. As far as the men are concerned, I'm moving you there to train you as a horse wrangler. It's a promotion, one you've earned. Harper rose on shaky legs, still scarcely believing her fortune. At the door she paused, turning back to the man who had just offered her a lifeline. Mr. Simmons. He looked up from the papers on his desk. Why are you helping me? A shadow crossed Mason's face, a flicker of old pain. Let's just say I understand what it means to be trapped in a life that doesn't fit, he said quietly. Now go. There's work to be done. The cabin was exactly as Mason had described, small, in need of repair, but private. A single room with a narrow bed, a pot-bellied stove, a rough wooden table, and a chair. The windows were grimy, the floor covered in dust, but to Harper, it looked like paradise. Here she could remove the painful binding at night. Here she could let down the exhausting guard she maintained every waking moment in the bunkhouse. Rufus helped her move her few possessions, his mismatched eyes curious but asking no questions. Boss says you got a talent with horses, he commented as Harper set her mother's photograph on the table. Says you're to work primarily with the new stock from now on. Harper nodded, unable to suppress a small smile of pride. Thank you for showing me the cabin, Mr. Johnson. Rufus lingered in the doorway, studying her with an intensity that made Harper nervous. You're different from the other hands, he said finally. Can't quite put my finger on it. Harper's heart stuttered, but she kept her expression neutral. Just trying to do my job, sir. Rufus nodded slowly. Well, you do it better than most. Dinner's at 6 in the main house. Don't be late. With that, he left the door, closing behind him with a decisive click. Alone, for the first time in months, Harper sank onto the edge of the bed, emotions washing over her in dizzying waves. Relief, gratitude, lingering fear, and beneath it all, a fragile hope. She was still Harper Wells, still hiding in plain sight, but now she had an ally in her deception. It was more than she'd dared to dream when she'd first set foot on Simmons' land. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Harper worked primarily with the horses, a task she loved more than any other. The animals responded to her gentle touch and quiet voice, even the most fractious becoming calm under her hands. The other ranch hands viewed her new position with a mixture of envy and respect, particularly when she succeeded in breaking the black stallion that had resisted all previous attempts. Mason kept his distance, publicly treating her no differently than any other worker. But occasionally he would stop by the corral to watch her work with a new horse, offering a nod of approval or a brief word of advice. And on some evenings after the day's work was done, he would invite her to his office to discuss the breeding program or plans for expanding the herd. These conversations were strictly professional, but Harper treasured them nonetheless, sensing in Mason a depth and intelligence she'd rarely encountered. Their professional relationship began to soften around the edges during these evening meetings. At first, they spoke only of horses and ranch business, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, personal details began to weave through their conversations. Childhood memories, books they'd read, observations about the changing seasons. Harper noticed how Mason would sometimes pause mid-sentence when she smiled, as if momentarily losing his train of thought. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, before these meetings washing the dust from her face, combing her short hair into some semblance of order. Autumn arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of color to the landscape. With the changing season came news that made Harper's blood run cold. A group of horse traders from Kentucky would be visiting the ranch looking to purchase stock for the racing circuit back east. Mason delivered this information during one of their evening meetings, watching her face carefully as he spoke. "They arrive in 2 days," he said. "I thought you should know." Harper's hands clenched in her lap. "Do you know which part of Kentucky?" "Lexington, primarily, though one is from a place called Harlan." Harlan, her hometown. Panic clawed at Harper's throat. "I should make myself scarce while they're here." Mason considered this, then shook his head. "That might raise questions. Better to continue as normal, but limit your interaction with them. I'll make sure you're assigned to the north pasture during their stay." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I wouldn't let harm come to you, Harper." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than Miss Wells, and the simple intimacy of it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the office grate. The concern in his eyes suggested more than just an employer's responsibility for a worker. "Thank you," she managed, voice unsteady. As promised, when the Kentucky traders arrived, 5 men on fine horses, their manner haughty and appraising Harper, was assigned to mend fences in the furthest pasture well away from the main ranch buildings. For 2 days, the strategy worked. She caught only glimpses of the visitors from a distance, their voices carrying on the wind as they inspected Mason's stock and haggled over prices. But on the 3rd day, as Harper returned from her solitary labor, she rounded the corner of the stable and came face to face with a tall, lean man with a shock of red hair and a neatly trimmed beard. William Parker, her father's business partner and closest friend. Recognition didn't dawn immediately. Parker's eyes slid over her without interest, then snapped back, narrowing in confusion. Harper ducked her head, tugging her hat lower, and made to move past him. "Hold on, boy!" Parker's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "Do I know you?" Harper kept her face averted, her voice gruff. "No, sir. Just a ranch hand. Look at me." The command was sharp, brooking no refusal. Slowly, Harper raised her gaze, praying that the months of sun and hard labor had changed her enough to avoid recognition. Parker studied her face with growing suspicion. "What's your name?" "Henry Smith, sir." The lie felt thick on her tongue. Parker's grip tightened painfully. "You remind me of someone, a girl from back home, who caused a heap of trouble." His eyes hardened. "Left her brother scarred for life, and her father grieving." Anger flared in Harper's chest at the twisted version of events. Samuel had recovered from his burns, she'd made sure of that before fleeing, and her father had never grieved for anything except his damaged property and wounded pride. "Sorry to hear that, sir," she managed, keeping her voice steady with effort. "But I've been in Texas for years, never been to Kentucky." Parker released her arm reluctantly, his expression still skeptical. "What happened to your eye, boy? That's a nasty scar." Harper's hand rose involuntarily to the faint mark left by her father's signet ring. "Bar fight in Amarillo," she lied. "Other fellow looked worse." A smile ghosted across Parker's face. "I bet he did." He seemed about to say more when a voice called his name from the direction of the main house. With a final searching look at Harper, he turned and walked away. Harper leaned against the stable wall, her heart hammering, sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool autumn air. Parker had suspected she'd seen it in his eyes, but he hadn't been certain enough to make an accusation. Not yet. But he'd be watching her now, looking for confirmation of his suspicions. She needed to warn Mason. She found him in the corral with Rufus and the other traders discussing the merits of a chestnut mare. Harper hovered at the edge of the gathering, catching Mason's eye and giving a slight nod toward the stable. He acknowledged her with an imperceptible tilt of his head, then smoothly excused himself, handing the negotiations over to Rufus. "What's happened?" he asked, as soon as they were alone in the shadowed interior of the stable. Harper explained her encounter with Parker, the suspicion in his eyes, the questions about her scar. "He knew my father well," she finished. "If anyone would recognize me, it would be him." Mason's expression darkened. "They leave tomorrow morning. Until then, stay out of sight. Sleep in the cabin, take your meals there. I'll have one of the boys bring them to you." Harper nodded gratefully. "Do you think he believed me?" "It doesn't matter," Mason said firmly. "By this time tomorrow, they'll be gone." He hesitated, then reached out to touch her shoulder, the contact brief but reassuring. "Don't worry. I won't let him take you." The simple declaration and the quiet intensity with which it was delivered sent a flutter through Harper's chest that had nothing to do with fear. She looked up to find Mason watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Concern, certainly, but something else, too. Something warmer and more personal than she'd seen before. That night, as darkness fell across the ranch, Harper paced the confines of her small cabin, too anxious to sleep. Parker's appearance had ripped open wounds she'd thought were healing, bringing the specter of her past roaring back to life. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick with remembered fear. A soft knock at the door startled her from her dark thoughts. She approached cautiously, one hand on the knife she kept at her belt. "Who is it?" "It's Mason." Harper opened the door to find the rancher standing on her threshold, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, 2 glasses in the other. "Thought you might need this," he said, lifting the bottle slightly. "Mind if I join you?" Harper stepped back to allow him entry, surprised by the unprecedented visit. In all the months she'd been at the ranch, Mason had never sought her out. After hours, never crossed the invisible boundary between employer and employee. He set the glasses on the rough table and poured a measure into each. Harper accepted hers with a murmured thanks, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as she swirled it thoughtfully. "Parker was asking questions at dinner," Mason said without preamble. "About you." Harper's fingers tightened around her glass. "What kind of questions? How long you'd been here? Where you came from before? Whether I knew your family?" Mason took a sip of his whiskey. "I fed him the story we agreed on, that you're an orphan from Amarillo who showed up looking for work 6 months ago. Did he believe you?" Mason's eyes met hers over the rim of his glass. "Hard to say. He's a suspicious man by nature, I think." Harper nodded grimly. William Parker had always seen deception and sin everywhere he looked, particularly in those who didn't conform to his narrow worldview. "He was like a second father to me once," she said softly, "before I understood what I was." "And what was that?" Mason asked, his voice equally soft. Harper gazed into her whiskey, searching for words to explain the inexplicable. "Different," she said finally. "I knew I was different almost as soon as I could walk. Dresses felt like prison. Dolls bored me. I wanted to climb trees, ride horses, explore the woods. My mother understood, or at least she didn't try to force me into a mold. But after she died, your father wasn't so understanding. He was embarrassed by me, his strange daughter who refused to be a proper lady." Harper took a long swallow of whiskey, welcoming the burn. "When I turned 16, he decided it was time to fix me. Arranged a marriage to Lucas Bennett, a widower with 3 children, and a reputation for keeping his women in line." Mason's expression darkened. "I assume you objected?" A bitter laugh escaped Harper. "I ran away the night before the engagement dinner. My father found me, dragged me home, and—" Her hand rose unconsciously to the scar by her eye. "He made his expectations clear." "The night of the fire." Harper nodded, the memories washing over her in vivid, painful detail. "I was desperate. I took money from his desk, just enough for a train ticket west, and hid in the tobacco barn to wait for dawn. I had a lantern. I must have knocked it over when I dozed off. She closed her eyes, seeing again the sudden flare of light, feeling the heat against her skin. Samuel came looking for me. He always followed me, hero-worshipped me, despite my father's disapproval. By the time I woke, the flames were everywhere. I got him out, but not before. Her voice broke. Mason waited patiently, refilling her glass when she emptied it with shaking hands. My father was already convinced I was unnatural possessed. The fire confirmed it for him. Harper forced herself to meet Mason's gaze, to face whatever judgment might lie there. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, I swear it. I believe you, Mason said simply, and the lack of condemnation in his voice nearly broke Harper anew. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the whiskey warming Harper's blood, softening the sharp edges of her fear. Outside, an owl called its haunting cry, floating on the night air. "You have your own ghosts, don't you, Mr. Simmons?" Harper asked suddenly, emboldened by the whiskey and the strange intimacy of the moment. Mason's expression shuddered briefly before he nodded. "Everyone who's lived long enough has ghosts. Would you tell me about them?" Fair exchange for my story. Mason studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a decision being weighed. Then he sighed, setting down his empty glass. "I had a sister," he said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "Jessica." Harper leaned forward, sensing the importance of this confession. Mason rarely spoke of family. The ranch hands speculated about his past in hushed tones around the campfire, but none knew the truth. "She was 7 years younger than me, bright, beautiful, stubborn as a mule." A faint smile touched Mason's lips at the memory. "Our parents died when I was 25. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. I inherited the ranch and Jessica." "She didn't want to be inherited," Harper guessed. Mason's smile turned sad. "No, she did not. She was 18, with dreams, wanted to study, to travel, to see the world beyond Texas. I thought I knew better, thought a respectable marriage would give her the security and status she deserved." The parallels to Harper's own story were not lost on either of them. "What happened?" she prompted gently when Mason fell silent. "I arranged a match with James Wilcott, son of the wealthiest rancher in the county. Jessica begged me not to make her go through with it, said she'd rather die than be Wilcott's wife." Mason's hands clenched around his empty glass. "I didn't listen. Told her she was being dramatic, that she'd thank me when she had a fine house and healthy children." His voice roughened as he continued. "The night of the wedding rehearsal, she disappeared. Left a note saying she was going east to Boston to make her own way, that I shouldn't look for her." Pain etched deep lines around Mason's mouth. "I ignored that too. Spent 3 years searching, hiring detectives, following every lead." "Did you find her?" Mason nodded, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, seeing not the cabin walls, but the ghosts of his past. "In a pauper's grave in St. Louis. She'd made it halfway to Boston, fallen ill with the same influenza that took our parents. Died alone in a charity hospital, no one even knowing her real name." Harper's throat tightened with shared grief. "I'm so sorry." "The cruel irony," Mason continued, his voice roughening, "is that I'd ended the engagement 2 weeks after she left. Finally saw Wilcott for what he was, a brute with a handsome face and a cruel streak. If she'd stayed—" He shook his head. "I've had 20 years to live with that knowledge. To wonder if I could have saved her, if I'd listened. If I'd respected her enough to hear what she was really saying." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Harper understood now why Mason had taken her in, why he'd been willing to keep her secret. In her, he saw a second chance, an opportunity to do for another what he'd failed to do for his sister. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "You were trying to protect her. As your father thought he was protecting you." Mason's gaze was sharp, challenging. "We men have a way of confusing control with care." Harper had no answer for that. She'd never considered her father's actions as misguided protection. They had felt only like punishment, like hatred. But perhaps from his warped perspective, forcing her into a traditional life had been an attempt to save her from herself. Mason rose, gathering the glasses and bottle. "It's late. The traders leave at first light. By noon tomorrow, this danger will have passed." He moved to the door, then paused, turning back to Harper. "Whatever happens, remember, you have a place here. I won't make the same mistake twice." As the door closed behind him, Harper sat in the lamplight, turning his words over in her mind. For the first time since fleeing Kentucky, she felt the tentative beginnings of something she'd almost forgotten belonging. Not just a job or a roof, but a place where someone saw her, truly saw her, and offered acceptance instead of condemnation. It was, she realized with a start, the closest thing to home she'd known since her mother's death. And with that realization came another, more unsettling one. Her feelings for Mason Simmons were evolving from gratitude to something deeper and more complex. Dawn broke pale and misty over the Simmons ranch. Harper stood at her cabin window watching as the Kentucky traders prepared to depart. Their horses were saddled saddlebags, bulging with supplies for the long journey east. William Parker stood apart from the others, engaged in intense conversation with Mason. Even from a distance, Harper could read the tension in Mason's posture, shoulders rigid, hands clasped firmly behind his back, the stance of a man containing his true emotions. Parker gestured animatedly, pointing toward the northern pasture, where Harper had been working yesterday. Mason shook his head, his response too low to carry on the morning air. Finally, with visible reluctance, Parker mounted his horse and joined his companions. The group moved away from the ranch house hooves, kicking up dust that glowed golden in the early light. Harper released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They were leaving. The immediate danger was passing. Yet the knot in her stomach refused to dissolve completely. William Parker was not a man to let go of his suspicions easily, and he had connections throughout the West, business partners, fellow traders, lawmen who owed him favors. If he decided to pursue his hunch about Henry Smith, distance alone might not be protection enough. A knock at her door startled Harper from these dark thoughts. She opened it to find Rufus standing on her threshold, his weathered face grave. "Boss wants to see you," he said, voice pitched low. "Right away." Harper nodded, heart sinking. Whatever conversation had transpired between Mason and Parker, it couldn't have been good to warrant such an urgent summons. She found Mason in his office, standing at the window that overlooked the eastern approach to the ranch, watching the distant figures of the traders disappear into the morning haze. He didn't turn as she entered, his focus fixed on the horizon. "Did you tell him?" Mason asked, his voice unnaturally calm. Harper froze halfway to his desk. "Tell who? What, sir?" "Parker." Now Mason did turn, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Did you tell him about the fire, about your brother?" "No, of course not." Harper shook her head vehemently. "I barely spoke to him." Mason studied her face, searching for truth or deception. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, for his shoulders relaxed fractionally. "He knows something. Asked a lot of questions about you this morning. Said you reminded him of someone, a girl who caused a tragedy back in Kentucky." Harper's throat tightened. "What did you tell him?" that Henry Smith has worked my ranch for 6 months, that you're the best horse wrangler I've seen in 20 years, and that he should be careful about making accusations without proof." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. He didn't appreciate that last part. Relief washed over Harper, followed quickly by a renewed surge of anxiety. He won't let it go, will he? Probably not. Mason moved to his desk, sinking into the chair with a weariness that aged him visibly. Parker mentioned sending telegrams, making inquiries, said it was his Christian duty to report a dangerous fugitive if his suspicions proved correct. "I'm not dangerous," Harper protested, the injustice of it burning in her chest. "I know that." Mason's voice softened, but Parker believes what he was told, that Eliza Wells deliberately set fire to her father's property out of rebellion and spite, leaving her brother disfigured. He sees himself as serving justice, not pursuing vengeance. The twisted narrative made Harper's stomach churn. How easily the truth had been rewritten to cast her as villain rather than victim. "What do we do?" Mason considered the question, fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. "We prepare. If Parker does send inquiries, they'll take time to bear fruit. Weeks, maybe months. That gives us space to establish countermeasures." "What kind of countermeasures?" "For one, we need to bolster your identity as Henry Smith. Create a paper trail, witnesses who can verify you've been in Texas for years, not months." Mason's mind was clearly working rapidly, strategizing. "I have friends in Austin, in the land office and judiciary. They can backdate certain documents, create a history for you." Harper stared at him, stunned by his willingness to involve himself so deeply in her deception. "You'd do that, risk your reputation, your standing, my reputation." A dry laugh escaped Mason. "Miss Wells, my reputation in this county was established long before you arrived. I'm known as a fair employer and a straight dealer, but I'm also known for valuing justice above law when the two conflict." His gaze held hers steadily. "And in your case, they most certainly conflict." The depth of his commitment left Harper momentarily speechless. She'd expected tolerance, perhaps even kindness, but this level of protection went far beyond what she'd dared to hope for. "Thank you," she said finally, the words woefully inadequate for the emotion behind them. Mason nodded briskly, moving on to practical matters. "In the meantime, you'll continue your work with the horses. Act normally. Give no one reason to question or suspect. If anyone asks about Parker and his friends, say only that they bought 3 mares for the racing circuit. Nothing more." "Yes, sir." As Harper turned to leave, Mason added, "And Miss Wells, perhaps it's time you learn to shoot. Properly, I mean. Rufus tells me you handle a rifle well enough for hunting, but a revolver is a different matter. I'll teach you myself starting tomorrow." The offer surprised her. While all ranch hands were expected to handle firearms for predator control, and the occasional hunting expedition, personal instruction from the ranch owner was unprecedented. "May I ask why?" "Because if trouble comes," Mason said quietly, "I want you to be able to defend yourself. And because a man who can't shoot straight raises questions in these parts." His eyes met hers, an unspoken connection passing between them. "And because I find I'm growing rather attached to having you around." The simple admission, delivered with such understated sincerity, sent warmth flooding through Harper's chest. The words themselves were hardly a declaration, but the way Mason held her gaze as he spoke them, the slight vulnerability in his normally composed features, suggested depths of feeling he was only beginning to acknowledge. The following weeks settled into a new rhythm. Each morning after breakfast, Harper would join Mason behind the stables for an hour of target practice. Under his patient instruction, her skill with a revolver improved rapidly, her natural steady hand and keen eye making her an apt pupil. By the end of October, she could hit a tin can at 20 paces 9 times out of 10, a proficiency that earned grudging respect from the other ranch hands, who occasionally stopped to watch. These training sessions became a cherished part of Harper's day. Standing close behind her, Mason would adjust her stance, his hands gentle but firm on her shoulders or arms. The casual touches, professional in nature, but charged with an awareness neither could quite ignore, added a layer of anticipation to their daily interactions. Sometimes their eyes would meet over the barrel of the gun, and Harper would find herself momentarily forgetting the lesson lost in the intensity of Mason's gaze. The rest of her days were spent with the horses, particularly the black stallion she'd named Midnight. The magnificent animal had gone from untamable to devoted under her gentle handling, following Harper around the corral like an oversized dog nickering softly when she approached his stall each morning. Mason had officially designated the stallion as hers, not merely to train, but to ride an honor that elevated her status among the ranch hands even further. As autumn deepened toward winter, the threat posed by William Parker receded in Harper's mind, overtaken by the daily rhythms of ranch life. Cattle were moved to winter pastures, buildings were repaired in preparation for the harsh months ahead, supplies were stockpiled against the possibility of being snowbound. There was a comfort in the routine and physical labor that left her too exhausted to dwell on darker thoughts. But if Harper began to relax her vigilance, Mason did not. She often found him in the evenings poring over newspapers from eastern cities, scanning for any mention of the Wells family or fires in Kentucky. Letters arrived regularly from his contacts in Austin, and beyond their contents never shared, but their effect visible in the tightening of Mason's expression, the deepening of the lines around his eyes. One crisp November evening, as Harper returned from a final check on the horses, she passed Mason's office and found the door ajar, voices drifting into the hallway. She recognized Rufus's distinctive rasp, his tone uncharacteristically urgent. "Telegram from San Antonio," he was saying. "Man matching Parker's description, asking questions at the land office. Looking for records on Henry Smith." And Mason's voice was calm, but with an edge of steel. "Nothing found, thanks to your foresight. But he ain't giving up. Heading to Austin next, according to my source." Harper froze outside the door, heart hammering against her ribs. Parker was actively investigating, moving methodically closer to exposing her deception. "We knew this might happen," Mason replied after a pause. "The documents we placed in Austin will hold up to scrutiny. Smith has a history now, orphaned at 14, worked 3 ranches, before mine paid taxes on a small plot outside Amarillo for 2 years. Papers can be questioned," Rufus pointed out. "Witnesses bought. This Parker fellow has resources and determination. Then we'll need to be equally determined." The sound of a desk drawer opening and closing, followed by the clink of glass against glass, Mason pouring his customary evening whiskey. "Have you noticed anything unusual around the ranch, strangers watching questions in town?" "Nothing obvious, but I've put the word out to be vigilant." A heavy silence fell. Harper was about to move away, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, when Rufus spoke again, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear. "There's something else, boss. Something you should know about young Smith." Harper's blood ran cold. Had Rufus discovered her secret? Had he somehow pieced together her true identity? "Go on," Mason prompted when Rufus hesitated. "The boy talks in his sleep. When he was still in the bunkhouse, I heard him more than once, calling out a name, Samuel, begging forgiveness." Relief and renewed anxiety warred in Harper's chest. Rufus hadn't discovered she was a woman, but he'd caught fragments of her nightmares enough to raise questions. "Many men have troubled dreams," Mason said evenly. War loss, regret, plenty of ghosts to go around. It ain't that. Rufus sounded uncomfortable now. It's the way the other hands look at him. They sense something different. Can't put their finger on it, but they know it's there. If this Parker stirs the pot, starts asking questions. The men are loyal to this ranch, to me, Mason interrupted firmly. They won't betray one of our own to a stranger based on vague suspicions. Maybe not deliberately, but a careless word, a slip. Rufus sighed heavily. Just thought you should know. The boy's secret, whatever it is, ain't as buried as he might think. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Harper ducked quickly into a shadowed alcove, pressing herself against the wall, as Rufus emerged from the office and strode down the hallway in the opposite direction. Only when his footsteps had faded completely did she exhale, trembling slightly with the narrowness of her escape. The conversation had confirmed her worst fears. William Parker was actively pursuing her, and the protective bubble of the ranch was not as secure as she'd allowed herself to believe. Even here, questions were forming, suspicions growing. How long before someone connected the dots, recognized the truth that hid beneath her careful disguise? Sleep eluded Harper that night. She lay awake in her small cabin, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, imagining Parker's relentless progress through Texas, drawing ever closer to her refuge. By dawn, she had made a decision, one that tore at her heart, but seemed the only logical choice. She would leave the Simmons ranch before Parker's investigation brought trouble to Mason's door. She packed her meager possessions, 2 shirts, a spare pair of trousers, the photograph of her mother, a small knife, and the revolver Mason had gifted her upon completion of her training. The weapon felt heavy in her hands, a symbol of his protection that she was now preparing to reject. A soft knock at her door startled her from these melancholy reflections. Harper hastily shoved her half-packed saddlebag under the bed before calling, "Come in." Mason stood on her threshold, his tall frame silhouetted against the pale morning light. His gaze swept the cabin, lingering on the items scattered across her bed, the clear evidence of her intentions. "Going somewhere, Miss Wells?" Harper saw no point in denial. "It's for the best, sir. Parker won't stop until he finds me, and when he does, everyone on this ranch will be implicated in harboring a fugitive." Mason stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "So your solution is to run again? Alone with winter approaching into country you barely know?" Put that way, her plan sounded not brave, but foolish. "I don't see another choice." "That's because fear is clouding your judgment." Mason moved to the small table, seating himself with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Sit down, Miss Wells, please." Harper perched reluctantly on the edge of her bed, hands twisting in her lap. "I received a letter yesterday from my contact in the Kentucky judiciary." Mason began his tone conversational, but with an undercurrent of tension. "It seems there have been developments in your case." Harper's head snapped up, eyes widening. "What kind of developments?" "Your brother Samuel has come forward with a statement about the fire. He claims it was an accident, that he was playing with matches in the tobacco barn against your father's strict instructions, and that you rushed in to save him when the fire broke out." The revelation struck Harper like a physical blow. Samuel had defied their father, had told the truth at last. That's what really happened," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "But father would never let him tell anyone. Said it would make the family look bad if people knew Samuel had been so careless." "Well, it seems Samuel found his courage," Mason continued. "He's 15 now, old enough to make himself heard. According to my source, he made his statement directly to the county judge, a man beyond your father's influence. The arson charge against you has been dropped." Yet a hope flared briefly in Harper's chest, before reality doused it. That doesn't change anything. I'm still a woman who's been living as a man deceiving everyone. In many places, that's enough to land me in jail." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And my father would still kill me if he found me." "Perhaps," Mason acknowledged, "but it does change the nature of the threat. Parker is hunting an arsonist, a dangerous criminal. Without that charge, his moral crusade loses much of its righteousness." "So you think I should stay?" Harper couldn't quite keep the longing from her voice. The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving the horses, the work she loved, the fragile sense of belonging she'd built, had been tearing her apart. "I think running should be your last resort, not your first instinct," Mason said gently. "This ranch, these people, they're your home now, Miss Wells, and one doesn't abandon home at the first sign of trouble." Home. The word resonated in Harper's chest like a bell, clear and true. This small cabin, the corral where she worked with her beloved horses, the main house with its bustling kitchen, and Mason's book-lined office. They had indeed become home in a way no place had been since her mother's death. What if Parker comes here? What if he brings the law? Then we face him together. Mason reached across the small space between them, taking her hand in his. "You're not alone anymore, Harper." It was the second time he had used her given name, and this time it was accompanied by the warm pressure of his hand around hers. The gesture was simple but profound, an acknowledgement of something growing between them, something neither had yet dared to name. "There's more," Mason continued after a pause. "My contact included a personal note with his official report. It seems your father has been making inquiries of his own, not for legal purposes but private ones. He's hired men to search for you." Fear clutched at Harper's throat. "Bounty hunters? Not exactly. More like private investigators, but with similar methods and fewer scruples." Mason's expression darkened. "Your father claims he wants to bring his wayward daughter home to save your immortal soul through proper guidance and discipline." The euphemisms did nothing to disguise the threat. Harper knew exactly what kind of guidance awaited her if her father ever found her the same brutality that had driven her to flee in the first place, perhaps worse, now that she had publicly humiliated him through her escape and Samuel's truth-telling. "So I'm still hunted," Harper said bleakly. "Yes." Mason didn't soften the reality. "But now we know who's hunting you and why. And knowledge is power, Miss Wells." The simple declaration steadied Harper, grounding her in the present moment, rather than future fears. Mason was right. Running now would solve nothing, might even make her more vulnerable. At the ranch, she had allies' protection, a fortress of sorts, against the dangers that pursued her. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay. For now, at least." Relief flickered across Mason's face, so brief Harper might have imagined it, except that his grip on her hand tightened momentarily before he released it. The gesture betrayed more emotion than his composed features, suggesting her decision meant more to him than he was willing to say aloud. "Good. Now, if you're done with this foolishness," he gestured to her half-packed bag, "there's work to be done. The new mare is showing signs of colic. Rufus thinks we may need to call the veterinarian from town." And just like that, they returned to the familiar routine of ranch life, the momentous conversation set aside in favor of immediate practical concerns. It was Mason's way. Harper had learned to face crises head-on, make decisions, and then move forward without dwelling on what might have been or what might yet come. As winter settled over the Texas plains, life on the Simmons Ranch turned inward. Snowstorms occasionally isolated them for days at a time. The main house becoming a hub of activity, with card games in the evening, storytelling around the massive fireplace, impromptu music when someone produced a harmonica or a fiddle. Harper kept to the edges of these gatherings, still cautious about too much close interaction with the other hands, but she found herself drawn into the camaraderie nonetheless, accepted as one of their own in a way that warmed her more than the blazing hearth. During these winter evenings, she began to notice changes in her interactions with Mason. They would find themselves sitting side by side during dinner, sharing quiet comments on the stories being told. Sometimes his hand would brush hers as he passed her a plate or a cup, the contact seemingly accidental, but lingering just a moment too long to be entirely casual. Once during a particularly fierce blizzard, he brought her a blanket as she sat reading by the fire, draping it around her shoulders with a tenderness that drew curious glances from Rufus. These small moments, insignificant in isolation, began to form a pattern, a subtle shift in their relationship that neither acknowledged directly, but both clearly felt. It was as though they were dancing around the edge of something new and fragile, neither quite brave enough to take the final step. Mason remained vigilant, maintaining contact with his network of informants across Texas and beyond. William Parker, it seemed, had returned to Kentucky after his fruitless inquiries in Austin, but the threat he posed had not entirely dissipated. More concerning were reports of strangers in nearby towns, men asking questions about the Simmons Ranch, and its workers, likely the investigators hired by Harper's father. One such report came on a bitter December evening as a blizzard raged outside the wind, howling like a living creature around the eaves of the main house. The ranch hands had gathered in the large kitchen nursing cups of coffee laced with whiskey against the cold. Harper sat near the stove, ostensibly mending a torn bridle, but actually half dozing in the comforting warmth. The slam of the front door jerked her to alertness. Rufus stamped into the kitchen snow, dusting his hat and shoulders, his expression grim. "Two men at the Broken Spoke," he announced without preamble, asking about a young man named Henry, offering cash for information. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Harper. She felt the color drain from her face, the bridle falling forgotten to her lap. "What did you tell them, Frank?" one of the older hands asked Rufus. "Nothing." Rufus brushed snow from his coat with aggressive swipes. "Told him I don't gossip about my people, not for any price. But others might not be so loyal. Jennings at the general store knows most of our hands by name." A murmur ran through the assembled men, concerned speculation, a hint of defensiveness. Harper felt exposed, vulnerable under their collective gaze. Did they suspect? Had they pieced together the connection between these strangers' questions and her presence on the ranch? "They say what they want with the boy." Another hand. A burly man called Hank nodded in Harper's direction. "Claim he's a runaway, that his family's looking for him worried sick." Rufus spat into the fire, his disdain for the story evident. "But they've got the look of men who do ugly work for pay-not-concerned relatives." Harper's hands trembled as she carefully folded the bridle, seeking something to occupy them to hide her fear. Her father's men it had to be. They'd tracked her to Texas, were closing in on the ranch. How long before they arrived at the gates, demanding to see Henry Smith? "Well, they won't find him here." Frank's declaration cut through Harper's spiraling panic. She looked up to find the older man watching her with a strange expression, not suspicion, but something almost like protectiveness. "That's right." Hank nodded firmly. "Ain't seen no Henry around these parts. Just a Smith fellow who keeps to himself and has a way with horses." One by one, the other hands voiced agreement, their meaning unmistakable. They would not betray Harper to the strangers, would deny any knowledge of Henry if questioned. Whether they understood the full truth of her situation or not, they had decided she was one of them, deserving of their protection. Tears pricked Harper's eyes at this unexpected display of solidarity. She ducked her head, pretending to focus on her mending to hide her emotion. These rough men, with their coarse language and calloused hands, had just offered her a gift beyond price, belonging acceptance, a place within their circle that no outsider could penetrate. Rufus cleared his throat. "Boss wants to see you," he said quietly to Harper as the other hands returned to their previous conversations. "In his office. Now." Harper nodded, gathering her composure before rising and slipping from the kitchen. As she passed through the hallway toward Mason's office, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window. A slender figure in men's clothing, hair cut short beneath a battered hat, features sharpened by months of hard work and constant vigilance. The woman she had been in Kentucky seemed a stranger now, a ghost from another life. Mason was standing at his fireplace when she entered, stoking the flames with a poker, his back to the door. He didn't turn immediately, and Harper took the opportunity to study him. The broad shoulders tensed with concern, the silver threading through his dark hair, the strength evident in every line of his tall frame. In the months since her arrival at the ranch, he had transformed in her eyes from an intimidating figure of authority to a complex man with his own burdens, his own regrets, his own capacity for unexpected kindness. And something more, a warmth and tenderness he revealed only in unguarded moments, increasingly frequent, as their relationship evolved. "Rufus told you about our visitors in town?" he said, finally turning to face her. "Yes." Harper clasped her hands to stop their trembling. "My father's men, most likely. They're being more careful than Parker was, not using names, not mentioning Kentucky. Just a concerned family looking for their wayward son." Mason's mouth twisted in a grimace. "A clever approach. Appeals to people's better instincts." What do we do?" Mason gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs before his desk, taking the other himself, rather than establishing the usual distance of employer and employee. "The storm works in our favor for now. No one's traveling these roads until it passes. That gives us time to prepare." "For what?" Harper perched on the edge of the chair, too tense to relax into its comfort. "For their eventual arrival here." Mason's bluntness was not unkind, merely practical. "Men like that, they'll work their way methodically through the area. This ranch is the largest employer for 50 miles. They'll come asking questions, perhaps, with some story about offering you a job, trying to get a look at the hands without raising suspicions." The scenario sent ice through Harper's veins. "And when they see me, that depends on how good their information is. If they have a detailed description, they will," Harper interrupted bleakly. "My father would have made sure of it." "And then we need to change your appearance." Mason studied her thoughtfully. "The beard you've been cultivating helps, but it's not enough. We need something more dramatic." Harper's hand rose unconsciously to her jaw, where months of carefully applying a mixture of bear grease and coffee grounds had produced a passable, if somewhat patchy, beard. The deception worked at a distance or in dim light, but wouldn't withstand close scrutiny. "What did you have in mind?" "An accident," Mason said, a plan clearly forming as he spoke. "Nothing serious, but enough to justify bandages that obscure your features. A fall from a horse, perhaps. Some facial injuries that are healing but still require covering." The idea was ingenious in its simplicity. Bandages would hide the delicate bone structure that was one of the most feminine aspects of Harper's appearance, while a plausible accident would explain her temporary absence from normal duties, keeping her away from direct interaction with visitors. "It could work," Harper agreed, hope kindling faintly. "It will buy us time, at least." Mason rose, moving to a cabinet where he kept his personal supply of whiskey. He poured 2 glasses, handing one to Harper, a gesture that had become something of a ritual between them during their private conversations. "But we need a more permanent solution." Harper sipped the amber liquid, letting it warm her from within. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "About what happens if, when they find me, Mason raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. I can't keep running forever. Each time I flee, I leave a trail connections that can be followed. Eventually, they'll catch up. Harper set her glass down with a decisive click. I need to confront this, somehow. Confront your father, you mean? Mason frowned. That would be extremely dangerous. Not directly, but through the law, perhaps. Harper leaned forward, animated by an idea that had been forming in her mind for weeks. You said the arson charge has been dropped because of Samuel's testimony. What if I could clear my name completely, make it safe for me to exist in the open, not as Henry, but as Harper? Mason considered this, swirling the whiskey in his glass. It's possible. With Samuel's statement and proper legal representation, you might be able to counter your father's narrative. But it would mean returning to Kentucky, facing him in court, publicly revealing your deception here. Are you prepared for that? The thought sent a shudder through Harper. To stand before her father again, to endure his hatred, to expose herself to the judgment of the community that had rejected her, it was terrifying. Yet the alternative, a lifetime of looking over her shoulder, of denying her true self, was equally unbearable. I don't know, she admitted, but I need to consider it, to have options beyond just hiding or running. Mason nodded slowly. A wise approach, and one we have time to develop. He rose, moving to the window where snow lashed against the glass. For now, we focus on the immediate threat. Tomorrow, you'll have your accident, nothing too dramatic, just enough to justify the bandages. After that, you'll stay close to the main house, away from visitors, until we know these men have moved on. The plan was sound, the best they could manage under the circumstances. Yet, as Harper finished her whiskey, she felt a strange reluctance to leave. These quiet moments with Mason had become precious to her, a space where she could be fully herself, without fear or pretense. I should go, she said finally, setting down her empty glass. It's late, and tomorrow will be eventful. Mason turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Harper, he said, his voice low and oddly hesitant. There's something I should tell you before... A sharp rap at the door interrupted him. Rufus's voice followed urgent. Boss riders approaching from the South Road. 6, maybe 7. Armed. Mason cursed softly. The storm must have broken sooner than expected. He moved swiftly to his desk, pulling a revolver from the drawer and checking its chambers. Rufus, wake the men. Positions around the house and barn, but no one fires, unless I give the word. Yes, sir. Rufus's footsteps retreated down the hallway. Mason turned to Harper, his expression grave. No time for subtlety now. Get to your cabin, gather only what you can't leave behind, then come back to the house through the kitchen door. Stay out of sight. Harper nodded, throat tight with renewed fear. Do you think it's them, my father's men? Too many for that, and coming too openly. More likely, local troublemakers taking advantage of the storm clearing to raid isolated ranches. Mason checked a second revolver before handing it to Harper. But it could be a diversion. Either way, I want you close. The simple declaration, made without hesitation even as potential danger approached, sent a flutter of warmth through Harper's chest, despite her fear. She nodded and slipped from the office, moving quickly through the darkened house toward her cabin. The night air bit at her face as she ran, snow crunching beneath her boots. Behind her, she could hear men's voices, orders being called, the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. When she reached her cabin, she wasted no time grabbing her mother's photograph, the knife, and a small pouch of coins she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Everything else could be replaced. As she made her way back to the house, keeping to the shadows between buildings, she caught sight of the approaching riders, dark shapes moving through the moonlit snow, rifles gleaming on their saddles. They didn't move like men intent on violence, but neither did they announce themselves like friendly visitors. Harper slipped in through the kitchen door, as instructed, finding the room empty, the ranch hands having taken up defensive positions throughout the house and yard. She could hear Mason's voice from the front porch, calm but authoritative. "That's far enough. State your business." A deep voice replied, the words indistinct to Harper's ears. She moved cautiously to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 6 riders sat their horses in a loose semicircle before the porch, their features shadowed beneath the brims of snow-dusted hats. The leader, a broad-shouldered man on a dappled gray, was gesturing as he spoke. "Looking for a fugitive?" His voice carried more clearly now. "Young woman, traveling as a man. Dangerous. Wanted for arson in Kentucky." Harper's blood froze. Not local raiders after all, but more men sent by her father, or worse, actual lawmen with an outdated warrant. The arson charge might have been dropped in Kentucky, but these men clearly hadn't received that news. "No fugitives here," Mason replied evenly. "Just ranch hands, all accounted for, all known to me personally." The leader dismounted, snow crunching under his boots. "Mind if we look around? We have reason to believe the fugitive might be in this area." "I mind very much," Mason's voice hardened. "It's the middle of the night in the dead of winter. My men are armed and on edge, as you can see. Come back in daylight with a proper warrant, and we can discuss this civilly." Tension crackled in the frigid air. Harper held her breath, one hand on the revolver Mason had given her. Would these men press the issue, force their way in? After a long moment, the leader nodded grudgingly. "We'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Simmons, with papers." He remounted his horse with deliberate slowness. "Until then." The riders wheeled their horses around and moved back down the drive, disappearing into the darkness. Only when they were completely out of sight did Mason give the order for the men to stand down. Harper sagged against the wall, relief washing through her like a physical wave. A temporary reprieve, nothing more, but at least they had until morning to prepare. Mason found her there moments later, his face grim in the lamplight. "You heard—" "Yes." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm for the panic churning inside. "They're coming back. With reinforcements and documentation likely." Mason ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomposure. "We need to move quickly. The plan changes." "How?" "No time for the bandage ruse now. They'll search the ranch thoroughly." Mason's mind was clearly racing, weighing options, discarding them just as rapidly. "You need to disappear before dawn." Harper's heart sank. "You want me to run after all?" "Not far." Mason's eyes met hers, intense and determined. "The line cabin in the north pasture. It's isolated, only used during roundup. Rufus will take you there tonight, along with supplies. With the snow, any tracks will be covered by morning." "And then, what, hide? Indefinitely?" The prospect filled Harper with despair. Another prison just larger than the one she'd fled in Kentucky. Mason's expression softened. "Not indefinitely. Just long enough for me to make arrangements." He touched her shoulder lightly. "Trust me, Harper. I have a plan." The quiet confidence in his voice steadied her. Despite everything, despite the men hunting her and the walls closing in, she did trust Mason Simmons with her safety, with her future, perhaps even with her heart. "All right," she agreed. The line cabin. Within an hour, she and Rufus were riding through the snow-blanketed darkness. Midnight moving sure-footed beneath her, despite the treacherous footing. They traveled in silence, conserving their energy against the bitter cold, following a route that kept to rocky outcroppings where the horses would leave minimal tracks. The line cabin was little more than a single room, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. but it was solid, the roof intact, the chimney drawing well once Rufus got a fire started. He helped her bring in supplies, food, extra blankets, firewood, a rifle with ammunition. "Boss says to stay put," Rufus told her as he prepared to leave. "No tracks, no smoke during daylight if you can help it. He'll come for you when it's safe." Harper nodded, throat tight with emotion. "Rufus," she began, unsure what to say. "Thank you, be careful. Sorry for the deception." The foreman cut her off with a gruff wave. "Save it, girl. Ain't the first secret I've kept for the boss, won't be the last." His mismatched eyes regarded her with surprising kindness. "You're good with horses. That's all that matters to me." With that simple declaration of acceptance, he was gone, leaving Harper alone with the crackling fire and her racing thoughts. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching into what felt like days. Harper dozed fitfully on the cot, waking at every sound, the crack of ice-laden branches, the distant howl of a coyote, the constant moan of the wind. By dawn she was exhausted, but too anxious to sleep. Following Rufus's instructions, she banked the fire, letting it die down to embers that would provide some warmth without producing visible smoke. Then she sat by the small window, peering through a gap in the shutters, toward the distant main ranch barely visible through the swirling snow. Would Mason's plan work? Would the searchers be satisfied with whatever explanation he provided? Or would they find evidence of her presence, track her to this remote cabin, drag her back to Kentucky, and the father who saw her as property to be controlled? The questions chased each other through her mind, unanswerable, maddening. To distract herself, Harper pulled out her mother's photograph, studying the gentle face that looked back at her from across the years. What would Eleanor Wells think of her daughter, now dressed as a man, hiding in a remote cabin pursued by her own husband's men? "You would understand," Harper whispered to the image. "You always did." Her mother had been the buffer between Harper and her father's rigid expectations, finding ways to allow her daughter small freedoms, riding astride rather than side saddle when Robert Wells was away, wearing boys' clothing for practicality, during horseback riding lessons, studying subjects typically reserved for male education under the guise of becoming a well-rounded lady. Eleanor's death when Harper was 13 had removed that protection, leaving her directly under her father's control. The years that followed had been a gradual constriction, like a noose, tightening inch by inch around her throat, until the arrangement with Bennett had become the final unbearable squeeze that forced her to flee. The crunch of snow outside jolted Harper from these memories. She froze, listening intently, one hand moving instinctively to the revolver at her side. Hoofbeats muffled by snow, but unmistakable. Someone approaching the cabin. Heart hammering. Harper moved away from the window, positioning herself behind the door. Gun raised. Had they found her trail already? Was this one of her father's men? Harper? Mason's voice low and urgent. "It's me." Relief flooded through her as she unbarred the door, letting Mason inside. Snow dusted his coat and hat. His face reddened from the cold. But it was his expression that caught her attention, a strange mixture of triumph and tension. "What happened?" she asked, helping him remove his frozen outer garments. "Did they search the ranch?" They did. Mason moved to the fireplace, adding wood to revive the banked embers. Very thoroughly, even had tracking dogs, though the snow limited their usefulness. "And," Harper prompted when he paused, "and they left empty-handed." A grim smile touched Mason's lips. "But not for lack of trying. Their leader fellow named Jackson had a federal warrant. Not for arson, interestingly, but for theft." "Theft?" Harper frowned in confusion. "I never stole anything except the train fare from my father's desk." "The charge claims you stole jewelry from your father's house family heirlooms worth a considerable sum. Mason's expression darkened. A fabrication, clearly, but enough to justify a federal warrant rather than a local one. Your father is pulling strings beyond Kentucky. Harper sank into a chair, the implications washing over her. So they'll keep searching, keep hunting me. Yes, Mason didn't soften the truth. But we have something they don't. What? Time and preparation. He knelt before the now blazing fire, warming his hands. I've sent Frank to Austin with letters for Judge Hamilton and my attorney. By the time he returns, we'll have legal documentation establishing your independence and challenging the theft charge. Hope flickered in Harper's chest, fragile but persistent. Will that be enough? It's a start. And Mason's eyes met hers, their blue depths reflecting the firelight. But I have something else in mind as well. Something more definitive. There was a note in his voice Harper hadn't heard before, a personal intensity beyond his usual protective concern. It sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. What do you mean? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mason rose from the hearth, moving to stand before her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his gaze cataloging her features as if committing them to memory. Then, with deliberate care, he took her hands in his. I mean that I'm tired of half measures and temporary solutions, he said quietly. Tired of watching you hide and run, of seeing you denied the right to live openly as yourself. Harper's breath caught in her throat. Mason, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I've spent 20 years living with regret for my sister, for chances not taken, for a life half-lived out of fear and duty. I won't add you to that list of regrets, Harper Wells. He drew a deep breath, his hands tightening around hers. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, startling in their simplicity, their directness. Harper stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? Marry me? Mason repeated, his voice steadier now. Not as Henry Smith, not as my niece Harper Simmons, but as yourself, Harper Wells. As my wife, you'd have legal protection beyond what any Declaration of Independence could provide. Your father's claims of theft would be countered by my statement that any items in your possession were gifts. And no court in Texas would force a married woman to return to her father against her will. Harper's mind raced, trying to process the pragmatic logic of his proposal while simultaneously grappling with the emotion behind it. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience, she said slowly. A legal shield. Something flickered in Mason's eyes, disappointment perhaps. Is that what you think this is? Isn't it? Confusion and a wild hope warred within her. A solution to my legal problems? That would be reason enough, Mason acknowledged. But no, Harper, that's not why I'm asking. His voice softened, growing husky with emotion rarely displayed. I'm asking because the thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again, is unbearable to me. Because in all my 45 years, I've never met anyone like you, so brave, so determined to live authentically, despite every obstacle. Because these past months, watching you with the horses, talking with you in my office each evening, seeing you find your place here, they've been the happiest of my life. Harper's heart seemed to stop, then restart with a painful lurch. You're saying, I'm saying I love you, Mason stated simply. Not as a ward to be protected, not as an employee, but as a woman of remarkable courage and strength. As someone I want to build a life with, if you'll have me. Tears welled in Harper's eyes, blurring her vision. Of all the futures she had imagined for herself when fleeing Kentucky, This had never been among them a proposal born not of convenience or social expectation, but of genuine love and respect. A partnership freely offered rather than an ownership imposed. "You don't have to answer now," Mason added quickly, misinterpreting her silence. "I understand it's sudden, and there are other considerations." Harper cut him off by leaning forward and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it effectively silenced him. When she pulled back, a smile trembled on her lips. "Yes," she said simply. Mason's expression transformed hope and disbelief, warring across his features. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Not for legal protection, though that's a compelling benefit." Harper's smile widened. "But because, somewhere between breaking midnight and our whiskey conversations, I fell in love with you too. Because you saw me, truly saw me, when no one else ever had." The joy that bloomed across Mason's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains, transformative, brilliant with promise. He drew her to her feet and into his arms, his embrace, gentle but secure, as if he feared she might change her mind if he held her too tightly. "It won't be easy," he warned, his breath warm against her hair. "Your father won't give up. Society will talk. Some will never understand or accept." "I've never taken the easy path," Harper replied, leaning back to meet his gaze. "Why start now?" Mason laughed, the sound rich with relief and happiness. Then he sobered, his expression growing earnest once more. "I meant what I said before about living authentically. If we do this, it will be on your terms, Harper. You'll dress as you choose, work as you choose. I'm not offering to make you a conventional wife." "Good," Harper said firmly, "because I'd make a terrible one." This time their kiss was neither brief nor chaste, but a proper sealing of their agreement, a promise more binding than any legal document. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "We should return to the ranch," he murmured. "Make preparations. The sooner we're legally bound, the sooner you're protected." Harper nodded, practicality reasserting itself through the haze of emotion. "Will Judge Hamilton marry us after what happened with the investigators?" "He will," Mason confirmed. "I've already broached the possibility in my letter. Once Frank returns with his response, we can proceed." The simplicity of the plan, the certainty in Mason's voice, steadied Harper. This wasn't an impulsive decision on either side, but one that had been forming for months through shared confidences and quiet moments, through crisis and calm alike. "Then let's go home," she said, the word feeling right on her tongue for the first time in years, "and face whatever comes next. Together." Judge Hamilton agreed to perform the ceremony at his private residence in Austin, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues that would inevitably follow such an unusual union. The winter weather delayed their journey, forcing them to wait until late January, when a break in the storms allowed for relatively safe travel. During those weeks of waiting, life at the ranch shifted subtly but significantly. Mason announced their engagement to the ranch hands at dinner one evening, his manner matter-of-fact, but unable to entirely conceal his happiness. "Smith, that is Harper Wells, and I will be married next month," he stated, his hand resting lightly on Harper's shoulder. "I realize this comes as a surprise to most of you and raises questions I'm not obligated to answer. But I will say this: Miss Wells has my complete respect and trust, as I hope she has yours. Anyone who can't accept that is welcome to collect their wages and seek employment elsewhere." A heavy silence followed this pronouncement. Harper sat rigid in her chair, braced for shock, disgust, even mockery. But it was Frank who broke the silence, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "About damn time," he said gruffly. "Been watching you two dance around each other for months." Startled laughter rippled around the table, breaking the tension. Rufus offered formal congratulations, his mismatched eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure. Even Hank, who had struggled most with Harper's revelation, managed a nod of acceptance. "Reckon this means we'll be calling you ma'am now," he drawled, a hint of his usual humor returning. "Not if you want me to answer," Harper retorted, earning another round of laughter. It wasn't universal acceptance. Two of the newer hands did indeed collect their wages and depart within the week, but it was more than Harper had dared to hope for. The core group of men who had worked the ranch for years adjusted to her new status with surprising adaptability, treating her with the same gruff respect they always had, neither overly familiar nor artificially distant. Mason, true to his word, made no attempt to change Harper's habits or appearance. She continued to dress in practical trousers and shirts for daily work, though she did allow Mrs. Thornton to create several modified riding skirts and tailored jackets for more formal occasions. Her hair grown out slightly, since her arrival at the ranch she kept short but neatly trimmed. Their relationship evolved during this period of waiting, becoming more openly affectionate, though still restrained by the standards of engaged couples. Mason would touch her hand at dinner, walk with her to the stables in the morning, occasionally kiss her forehead or cheek when they parted for the day. These small gestures, unremarkable in most courtships, felt revolutionary to Harper after a lifetime of emotional and physical constraint. The most significant change came in their conversations, which moved from Mason's office to the small sitting room adjacent to his bedroom. Here in the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would talk for hours, planning the future of the ranch, discussing books they'd read, sharing memories and hopes. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, Harper mending tack or clothing, while Mason reviewed ledgers or correspondence. It was during one such quiet evening, a week before their planned departure for Austin, that Mason set aside his paperwork and regarded Harper with unusual solemnity. "There's something we should discuss," he said, "before we make this official." Harper looked up from the shirt she was repairing, a thread of unease winding through her at his tone. "What is it?" Mason hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care. "Children. We haven't spoken of them." The subject caught Harper by surprise. In all her considerations of marriage, first the dreaded union with Bennett, then this unexpected partnership with Mason, the question of children had remained abstract, theoretical. "No," she agreed cautiously. "We haven't. I want you to know that I have no expectations in that regard." Mason's gaze held hers steadily. "If motherhood is something you desire, I would welcome a family with you. If not, if the very idea is unwelcome, I am content with things as they are. This ranch, the horses, the life we're building together, it's enough for me." The simple honesty of his declaration, the absence of pressure or expectation, touched Harper deeply. How different from what her future with Bennett would have been, where children were not a choice, but an obligation, a continuation of the family name and fortune. "I've never thought of myself as a mother," she admitted. "It always seemed part of a life I was running from, not toward." She set her mending aside, gathering her thoughts. "But I've never been opposed to the idea itself, only to the lack of choice, to motherhood as an inevitable consequence of being female rather than a deliberate decision." Mason nodded, understanding, without need for further explanation. "Then we'll let the future unfold as it will. No pressure, no timetable, no expectations either way." Another gift, Harper realized, the freedom to discover her own feelings about motherhood without the weight of societal or spousal demand. Another example of Mason offering choice where others had imposed obligation. "Thank you," she said, simply knowing he would understand all that lay behind those two words. Mason smiled, the seriousness lifting from his expression. "For what it's worth," he added lightly, "I think you'd make a remarkable mother patient, with mistakes firm against true wrongdoing, unconditionally supportive of whoever your child turned out to be. The same qualities that make you so effective with the horses." The comparison startled a laugh from Harper. "Are you suggesting raising children is like breaking Mustangs? More similarities than differences, I expect," Mason replied with a wry smile. "Both require boundless patience, consistent boundaries, and the wisdom to know when to hold tight and when to let go." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Harper found herself returning to it in quiet moments over the following days. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a child, not as an abstract concept, but as a specific possibility. A boy with Mason's steady gaze and her own stubborn determination. A girl free to climb trees and ride bareback, to choose her own path, without the constraints Harper had faced. The image was not unwelcome. Their journey to Austin took 3 days, the roads still partially snow-covered and treacherous in places. They traveled with Frank and Rufus, as witnesses, the four of them making steady progress despite the conditions. Harper wore one of her new riding skirts for the trip, finding the garment surprisingly practical for horseback travel, while still marking her visibly as female, a precaution against potential questions or confrontations along the way. Judge Hamilton welcomed them to his comfortable home on the outskirts of Austin, his manner warm but cautious. "Your timing is fortunate," he told them over dinner that first evening. "Had you delayed another week, you might have encountered difficulties." "What sort of difficulties?" Mason asked. "Your Miss Wells's father has engaged attorneys here in Austin, 3 of them all well-connected. They've been making inquiries, filing petitions." Hamilton shook his head, clearly troubled. "I've delayed matters where possible, but they're persistent." Harper's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. "What kind of petitions?" "Various legal maneuverings. The most concerning is a petition for a sanity hearing alleging that you are mentally unstable and require your father's continued guardianship despite being of legal age." "That's absurd," Mason said sharply. "Indeed, but not without precedent." Hamilton's expression was grave. "Women who defy conventional expectations are frequently labeled hysterical or deranged. The fact that you lived disguised as a man for months would be presented as evidence of delusional thinking." The room seemed to tilt slightly around Harper. After all her struggles, all her careful planning, could her father still reach across the miles and drag her back to Kentucky through this legal trap? "The marriage would prevent this?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "It would complicate matters significantly," Hamilton confirmed. "As a married woman, your legal status would change. Your father's claim to guardianship would be superseded by your husband's legal authority." Harper flinched slightly at the archaic terminology, the implication that she was simply trading one master for another. Mason, noting her reaction, shook his head. "Let's be clear about what that means in practice," he said firmly. "It means that immediately after our marriage, I will sign documents prepared by Judge Hamilton affirming your full legal and financial independence within our marriage, your right to own property separately, to make contracts in your own name, to conduct business affairs without my signature or approval." Hamilton nodded approvingly. "Precisely the documentation I've already drawn up based on your earlier correspondence. Unusual, but entirely legal under Texas territorial law, which allows for more flexibility in such matters than many eastern states." Harper's tension eased somewhat. "And this would protect me from my father's legal maneuvers." "It creates significant barriers," Hamilton said cautiously. Not impenetrable ones, a determined man with resources could still attempt legal action, but substantial enough to make such efforts difficult and time-consuming. And time, Miss Wells, is on your side. The longer you establish yourself here, build connections, demonstrate your competence and stability, the weaker your father's claims become. The judge's clear-eyed assessment, neither overly optimistic nor needlessly frightening, steadied Harper. This was a challenge to be faced strategically, not a disaster to be fled from in panic. Then we proceed as planned, she decided, meeting Mason's gaze across the table. Tomorrow, he agreed, his smile conveying both reassurance and anticipation. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, performed in Judge Hamilton's book-lined study, with only the judge's wife, Frank, and Rufus as witnesses. Harper wore a simple dress of deep blue, not white, which would have felt like a lie, given all she had experienced, but a color that suited her coloring and complemented the silver threading through Mason's dark hair. Mason had commissioned rings from Austin's finest jeweler, simple bands of gold with a pattern of intertwined horseshoes engraved around the circumference. The symbolism made Harper smile when she first saw them, horses, the passion that had brought them together, and interlocking circles representing their partnership of equals. I, Mason James Simmons, take you, Harper Eleanor Wells, to be my lawfully wedded wife. Mason's voice was steady as he repeated the traditional words, his eyes never leaving hers. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When it came Harper's turn, her voice trembled slightly on the first words, but grew stronger as she continued infusing the centuries-old vow with her own fierce determination. I, Harper Eleanor Wells, take you, Mason James Simmons, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Texas, Judge Hamilton concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He smiled, adding with deliberate emphasis, You may kiss your bride, Mr. Simmons. The kiss was gentle but lingering, a public affirmation of private feelings that had grown between them over months of shared struggles and quiet conversations. When they parted, Harper found herself blinking back unexpected tears, not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so intense it bordered on pain. Mrs. Simmons, Mason murmured, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. Harper Wells Simmons, she corrected softly. I'd like to keep both names if you don't mind. His smile deepened. I'd expect nothing less. The legal documents were signed immediately after the ceremony: marriage certificate, property agreements, declarations of independence. By the time they left Judge Hamilton's study, Harper was not only Mason's wife, but also the legal owner of a 20-acre parcel of the Simmons Ranch, transferred into her name as a wedding gift, with full rights to develop or manage it as she saw fit. Land of your own, Mason explained when she stared at the deed in disbelief. No one can take it from you, not even me. Whatever happens, you'll always have a place that belongs entirely to you. It was a gift beyond price, in a world where women's property typically became their husbands upon marriage, a concrete demonstration of Mason's commitment to their partnership of equals. Harper's throat tightened with emotion as she carefully folded the document and tucked it into her pocket. Thank you, she said simply, knowing he would understand the depth of gratitude behind those inadequate words. They spent one more night in Austin before beginning the journey home. Despite the legal protections now in place, both felt a certain urgency to return to the ranch, to the relative safety of familiar territory surrounded by loyal men. Harper's father might have been temporarily outmaneuvered, but neither believed he would abandon his pursuit entirely. Their first night as husband and wife was spent in a comfortable guest room in Hamilton's home, a fact that had caused Harper more anxiety than she cared to admit. Despite their months of growing closeness, despite the kisses and touches that had become increasingly frequent since their engagement, the physical aspect of marriage remained uncharted territory. Mason, with his characteristic sensitivity to her feelings, made no demands that night. They prepared for bed separately, Harper changing into a simple nightgown behind a screen, while Mason banked the fire and extinguished most of the lamps. When she emerged, he was already in bed, the covers turned down invitingly on her side. "We have time," he said simply as she slid beneath the blankets, keeping a cautious distance between them. "All the time you need." Relief and gratitude washed through Harper, followed by a surprising flicker of disappointment. She had been nervous, yes, but not unwilling. Curious even about this aspect of their relationship that had remained theoretical until now. Gathering her courage, she moved closer, resting her head tentatively on Mason's shoulder. "And if I don't need much time at all?" In the dim light of the single remaining lamp, she saw his expression shift from calm acceptance to something warmer, more intent. "Then we proceed at whatever pace feels right to you," he said, his voice deepening, "with the understanding that we can stop at any point, for any reason." Another choice, freely offered, another opportunity to set her own boundaries. Harper felt a surge of love for this man who understood so intuitively what she needed most, not protection, not possession, but the freedom to discover herself, including this aspect of herself, without fear or pressure. "Kiss me," she whispered, tilting her face up to his, "and we'll see where it leads." It led, as such things often do between people who genuinely love and respect each other, to a night of gentle discovery, of whispered questions and murmured assurances, of occasional awkwardness overcome by shared laughter. Harper found herself surprised not by the physical act itself, which was much as her mother had once hesitantly explained it would be, but by the emotional intensity that accompanied it, the profound sense of connection, of being known and accepted completely. When dawn broke, finding them tangled together beneath the blankets, Harper felt not the shame or discomfort she had always associated with this aspect of marriage, but a deep contentment, a sense of having crossed an important threshold, not just in body, but in heart and mind as well. "Good morning, wife," Mason murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Good morning, husband," she replied, the word still strange on her tongue but increasingly welcome. "Ready to go home?" His smile told her everything she needed to know, that home was no longer just a place for either of them, but a person. Each other. Their return to the ranch was marked by a quiet celebration, a special dinner prepared by Mrs. Thornton, a few bottles of good whiskey shared among the hands, heartfelt, if awkward, congratulations from men more comfortable with actions than words. No formal announcement of the marriage was made to the larger community, but news traveled quickly in the territory. Within weeks, the fact of Mason Simmons's unexpected marriage to a young woman previously disguised as a male ranch hand was common knowledge from Austin to Dallas. Reactions varied widely. Some neighbors, particularly those with traditional views, kept their distance, unsure how to respond to such an unconventional union. Others, more progressive or simply more curious, made a point of calling at the ranch, thinly veiled interest in their eyes as they assessed Harper. She met these visits with straightforward dignity, neither apologizing for her past nor flaunting her unusual history. She was Harper Wells Simmons, now wife of a respected rancher's skilled horse trainer, woman of property. If her trousers and short hair raised eyebrows, if her preference for working with the horses rather than keeping house caused whispers, so be it. Mason supported her choices unwaveringly, making it clear to anyone who called that he considered his wife's unique skills and perspective assets, not liabilities. When one particularly bold visitor asked outright if he didn't find her mannish ways disturbing, Mason replied with deceptive mildness that he found narrow-mindedness far more disturbing than independence of spirit, and perhaps the visitor might be more comfortable leaving now. Word of such incidents spread, establishing boundaries that most neighbors learned to respect. By spring, the initial furor had died down, replaced by a wary acceptance. Harper might never be fully embraced by conventional society, but neither was she actively ostracized. It was she reflected more than she had dared hope for when fleeing Kentucky. The legal protections established through their marriage proved their worth in April when Robert Wells himself arrived in Austin, accompanied by William Parker and a team of lawyers. Judge Hamilton sent word to the ranch immediately warning of potential legal action. "Your father claims you took jewelry belonging to your late mother," the judge's letter explained. "Items he describes as family heirlooms intended for your future children, not personal property. He's seeking a court order for their return." Harper read the letter with disbelief. "I took nothing but $5 and the clothes on my back," she told Mason, indignation rising. "The only thing of my mother's I have is her photograph." "He knows that," Mason replied grimly. "This isn't about jewelry. It's about getting you into a courtroom where he can challenge your mental competence, your right to live independently." "But you said the marriage would prevent that." "It creates barriers," Mason corrected, echoing Hamilton's earlier caution. "Not impenetrable ones. A determined man with resources can find legal pathways around almost anything." The realization that her father's pursuit hadn't ended with her marriage sent a familiar chill through Harper. Would she never be truly free of him? Would he hound her across states and territories, inventing charges, filing petitions, disrupting the life she was struggling to build? "What do we do?" she asked, fighting to keep the despair from her voice. Mason considered the question, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "We could fight this, legally challenge his claims about the jewelry, present evidence of your mental soundness, establish your right to live as you choose. Hamilton believes we would eventually prevail. But legal battles are expensive, time-consuming, and public. Every detail of your life would be examined, dissected in open court. Your disguise as Henry, your unconventional marriage, your rejection of traditional female roles, all would be presented as evidence of instability or delusion." The prospect made Harper's stomach churn. "You're saying we shouldn't fight. I'm saying there might be another approach." Mason folded Hamilton's letter carefully. "Your father is a businessman at heart. He understands profit and loss, investment and return. Perhaps it's time to speak to him in those terms." Understanding dawned. "You want to buy him off." "I want to make continuing this pursuit more costly than abandoning it," Mason corrected. "Not just in financial terms, though, that would be part of it, but in terms of reputation, standing, future prospects." Harper considered this, weighing her knowledge of her father against Mason's strategic thinking. Robert Wells was indeed driven by practical considerations more than emotional ones. His pursuit of her had begun as a matter of control, yes, but had evolved into a question of public face, of not being seen to lose. It could work, she acknowledged, but he'd have to save face somehow. He couldn't just abandon the search without some justification his community would accept. "Precisely," Mason nodded approvingly. "Which is why I propose a negotiated settlement not directly about you, but about the supposed jewelry. We offer financial compensation for these family heirlooms with the understanding that all legal actions cease immediately and permanently. He gets money and can tell people he recovered what was rightfully his," Harper translated. while actually giving up his claim to control me. Exactly. And we include a non-disclosure clause. Any public discussion of you, your choices, or your current life would invalidate the settlement and require full repayment. The plan was elegant in its practicality, appealing directly to Robert Wells's business instincts while giving him a socially acceptable way to end his pursuit. Whether it would work depended entirely on how much of her father's motivation was practical and how much was driven by deeper, more irrational needs for control and vengeance. It's worth trying, Harper decided. But I want to be there when the offer is presented. I want to look him in the eye one last time. Mason studied her face, clearly weighing her determination against his protective instincts. Are you sure it won't be an easy meeting? I'm sure. Harper's straightened chin lifting. I've spent my whole life running from him first, within our home, trying to avoid his notice, then across the country trying to escape his reach. I want this to end with me standing my ground facing him as an equal. Pride and concern warred in Mason's expression before he nodded. Then we'll face him together. The meeting was arranged for neutral ground, a private dining room in Austin's finest hotel. Harper dressed with particular care that morning, choosing a modified riding skirt and tailored jacket that balanced femininity with practical comfort. She wore her hair neatly combed, but unadorned her mother's locket, her only jewelry. You look perfect, Mason told her as their carriage approached the hotel. Strong, composed, exactly as you should. His reassurance steadied her, as did his hand at the small of her back, as they were escorted to the private room. Judge Hamilton was already there along with Mason's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Hollis, who specialized in property law and had a reputation for formidable negotiating skills. Robert Wells arrived precisely on time, accompanied by William Parker, and a lawyer whose expensive suit and supercilious expression announced him as Eastern-trained and accustomed to deference. Harper's father himself looked much as she remembered, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. Only the new lines around his mouth and a certain hollowness in his cheeks suggested the toll of the past year. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Harper, though he quickly masked his reaction behind a facade of cold dignity. Eliza, he greeted deliberately, using her given name. Father, Harper replied evenly. It's Harper now, Harper Wells Simmons. She indicated Mason beside her. My husband. Robert Wells's gaze flicked to Mason, assessing, calculating. Mr. Simmons, I understand you've acquired my daughter under somewhat unusual circumstances. I've married her with her full and enthusiastic consent. Mason corrected, his tone pleasant, but with steel beneath. After she had already established herself independently on my ranch through her exceptional skill with horses. Parker made a small, disparaging sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or scoff. Harper turned her attention to him, noting the same lean, hawkish features, the same air of moral certainty that had always characterized her father's closest friend. Mr. Parker, she acknowledged coolly. Still doing my father's bidding, I see. A flush crept up Parker's neck, but before he could respond, the Eastern lawyer smoothly intervened. Perhaps we could proceed to the matter at hand, he suggested, his accent marking him as Boston-educated. I understand there is a proposal regarding the disputed items. Indeed. Mrs. Hollis took control of the conversation with practiced ease, outlining the terms of the proposed settlement, a substantial sum in exchange for dropping all legal claims with strict confidentiality requirements and penalties for breach. As she spoke, Harper watched her father's face, trying to read his thoughts behind the impassive mask. Was he considering the offer seriously, or merely humoring them before rejecting it outright? When Mrs. Hollis finished, Robert Wells remained silent for a long moment, fingers steepled before him. An interesting proposal, he said finally, but it fails to address the central issue. Which is, Mason prompted, my daughter's mental state and well-being. Wells's gaze shifted to Harper, his expression a mixture of concern and disapproval that she remembered all too well from childhood. Eliza has always been unstable, prone to unconventional behaviors, resistant to proper feminine guidance. Her mother indulged these tendencies to her detriment. After Eleanor's death, I attempted to provide the structure and discipline she clearly needed, only to be met with increasing rebellion. The familiar narrative, her as wayward and troubled him as the patient-concerned father, ignited a slow burn of anger in Harper's chest. How many times had she heard this version of their relationship, this rewriting of her legitimate desire for autonomy as mental instability? "Father," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the emotion churning within. "We both know that's not true. I was never unstable, just unwilling to be forced into a mold that didn't fit me. You couldn't accept, that couldn't tolerate a daughter who preferred trousers to dresses, who wanted to work with horses rather than practice needlepoint, who refused to marry a man she'd never met and didn't love." Robert Wells's jaw tightened. "You see, this distorted perception is shared by others," Harper cut in. "By Samuel, who has testified to your treatment of me. By Dr. Fielding, who documented the injuries you inflicted when I defied you. By Mrs. Abernathy, who witnessed your escalating control after Mother died." She leaned forward slightly. "The truth isn't just my word against yours anymore, Father. There are witnesses, records, evidence." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her father's face, brief but unmistakable. He hadn't expected this counterattack, hadn't anticipated that she would have marshaled support for her version of events. "The settlement offer is generous," Mason interjected smoothly, seizing the moment of weakness. "It allows you to return to Kentucky with a financial recovery and your reputation intact. The alternative is a prolonged legal battle that will expose details I imagine you'd prefer to keep private." The implied threat hung in the air, not just exposure of Robert Wells's treatment of his daughter, but the public humiliation of having that treatment judged and condemned by a court. In status-conscious Kentucky, such scandal could affect business relationships, social standing, even the marriage prospects of his remaining child. Parker leaned close to Wells, murmuring something too low for Harper to hear. Her father listened, his expression shifting from stubborn resistance to calculating consideration. "I would need assurances," he said finally, "that Eliza Harper is being properly cared for, that this arrangement is legitimate and stable." "You're looking at those assurances," Judge Hamilton spoke up for the first time. "As the officiating magistrate at their wedding and a witness to their legal arrangements, I can attest to the genuine nature of this marriage and to Mrs. Wells Simmons's sound mind and full consent in entering it." Robert Wells's gaze returned to Harper, studying her with an intensity that reminded her of childhood examinations, checking her clothing, her posture, her demeanor for any hint of the rebellion he seemed determined to find and quash. "You truly wish to remain here?" he asked, his voice holding a note she hadn't heard before. Not anger or disapproval, but something almost like genuine question. "In this place, living this unconventional life?" The simple directness of the query, so unlike their usual charged interactions, caught Harper off guard. For the first time, she felt her father might actually be listening, not simply waiting for his chance to impose his will. "Yes," she said quietly. "This is where I belong, where I can be myself, not as the daughter you wanted, but as the person I actually am." She gestured to Mason beside her. "With someone who values that person, not despite my differences, but because of them." Something shifted in Robert Wells's expression, not softening exactly, but a subtle alteration, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "You have your mother's stubborn streak," he said after a moment, the words holding an unexpected note of what might almost have been admiration. "She would have approved of this, I think, of you standing your ground." The observation, so unexpected and yet so insightful, brought a sudden sting of tears to Harper's eyes. "Yes," she managed, "I think she would have." Robert Wells turned to his lawyer. "Draw up the papers," he instructed. "We'll accept the settlement as outlined with one addition." He focused on Harper once more. "Samuel wishes to know your well. I would like your permission to tell him the basic facts that you're married, settled in Texas, and content with your choice. Nothing more." The request, not a demand, but an actual request, suggested a shift in their relationship that Harper hadn't thought possible. "You may tell Samuel that," she agreed cautiously, "and that he's welcome to write to me, if he wishes, through Judge Hamilton's office." She wasn't ready to provide her direct address, not yet. Her father nodded, accepting the limitation without argument. "Then we have an agreement." The paperwork took several hours to complete, review, and sign. Throughout the process, Harper remained alert for any sign of trickery or hidden clauses, but the settlement proved straightforward, a substantial payment in exchange for the end of all legal actions and claims, with strict confidentiality provisions protecting both parties from public discussion of the arrangement. When the final signatures were in place, Robert Wells rose from the table. "Goodbye, he began, then corrected himself. "Harper, I cannot say I understand or approve of the path you've chosen, but I acknowledge your right to follow it." It wasn't an apology or a blessing, but from a man as rigid and controlling as Robert Wells, it was a significant concession, perhaps the most he was capable of making. "Goodbye, Father," Harper replied, not quite able to match his formal tone. Despite everything, despite the years of conflict and control, he was still the man who had taught her to ride, who had read to her when she was small, who had in his own misguided way tried to prepare her for a world he saw as hostile and dangerous. "I hope you find peace." A flicker of something regret, perhaps, or simple recognition crossed his face. Then he nodded once formally and left the room, Parker and the lawyer trailing in his wake. Harper sat very still as the door closed behind them, a tumult of emotions washing through her: relief, lingering anger, a strange grief for the father-daughter relationship that might have been under different circumstances, and beneath it all, a growing sense of freedom, of a weight lifting that she had carried for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand unburdened. Mason's hand found hers beneath the table, warm and steadying. "It's done," he said softly. "Truly done." And it was at least the legal battle, the immediate threat of being forced back to Kentucky or declared mentally incompetent. The emotional aftermath would take longer to process, the psychological wounds of years of control and rejection longer still to heal. But for the first time since fleeing her father's house, Harper felt the future opening before her without the shadow of pursuit hanging over it. "Let's go home," she said, rising from the table. "We have a ranch to run." The months that followed brought a steady settling into their new life together. Harper continued her work with the horses, developing a breeding program focused on intelligence and temperament, as well as physical strength and speed. Mason managed the broader ranch operations while providing her with the freedom and support to pursue her own projects. Their marriage deepened from its strategic beginnings into a genuine partnership of equals, each bringing different strengths to their shared life. Harper's unconventional perspective and intuitive understanding of animals complemented Mason's business acumen and steady leadership. Together, they began to transform the Simmons Ranch from a solid but unremarkable operation into something innovative and forward-looking. Summer brought an unexpected letter, forwarded through Judge Hamilton's office as arranged. Samuel's handwriting, still boyishly uneven but instantly recognizable, brought a lump to Harper's throat before she even broke the seal. Dearest sister, the letter began formal yet warm. Father has told me of your marriage and new life in Texas. While he speaks of it with reserve, I detect a grudging respect beneath his customary disapproval. Your courage in forging your own path has affected him more than he would ever admit. Samuel went on to describe his own life, his studies, his friends, his growing interest in the family business. Father has softened somewhat since your departure, he wrote. Perhaps losing you has made him value me more, or perhaps he simply grows tired as age advances. Whatever the reason, he consults me now on business matters, considers my opinions with surprising seriousness. Most touching was his conclusion, I hope someday to visit you in Texas, to meet this husband who values you as you deserve, to see for myself the life you've built from courage and determination. Until then, know that you are missed, but also admired, not just by me, but by others who lacked the bravery to say so while Father's rage was at its height. You've become something of a legend among the young women of Harlan you know. The girl who refused to be broken, who rode west to freedom rather than surrender her spirit. I could not be prouder to call you sister. Harper read the letter to Mason that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the plains in gold and crimson. When she finished, she found her voice choked with emotion. He doesn't hate me, she managed. Even after everything, the fire, the scars, the scandal, he still loves me. Of course he does, Mason said gently. You saved his life, Harper. Not just from the fire, but from the belief that submission was the only option. You showed him another way to be. The observation resonated deeply. Perhaps that was the true gift of her journey, not just claiming her own freedom, but demonstrating to others that such freedom was possible, that the boundaries society erected were neither as solid nor as immutable as they appeared. As fall approached, bringing the first anniversary of her arrival at the ranch, Harper began to implement another long-considered plan, the creation of a training program for young women interested in horsemanship. The idea had germinated during her early days as Henry Smith, when she'd observed how differently she was treated as a perceived male compared to her experiences as Eliza Wells. There must be other girls like me, she told Mason as they discussed the concept. Not necessarily ones who feel uncomfortable with their gender, but ones who love horses, who have a natural talent for working with them, who are limited only by society's expectations of what women can or should do. I've no doubt you're right, Mason agreed. But how do you propose to find these girls? And more importantly, how do you convince their families to allow them to participate? It was a practical question, one that acknowledged the realities of a world not yet ready to embrace Harper's vision of gender equality. But rather than discouraging her, it challenged her to think strategically, to find a path forward that could work within existing constraints, while gradually expanding what was possible. We present it as specialized training in appropriate equestrian skills, she suggested. Ladies riding horse care and management, all respectable activities for young women of good families. We emphasize safety, proper supervision, character development. Mason nodded, seeing the approach. And once they're here, a smile curved Harper's lips. Once they're here, they learn what they're truly capable of. How to break a horse, not just ride one side saddle. How to manage a breeding program, not just arrange flowers in a stable. How to exist on their own terms, not just within the narrow confines society has designated as appropriate. A Trojan horse approach, Mason observed with a mix of admiration and concern. Clever, but potentially controversial, once parents realize what their daughters are actually learning. We'll be transparent about the practical skills, Harper clarified. Many families, especially here in the territories, value daughters who can contribute to ranch operations beyond decorative roles. We'll just emphasize different aspects of the program depending on the family's perspective. The plan took shape over the following months, a residential training program for young women aged 16 to 20, focusing on comprehensive horsemanship, with accommodations for varying levels of prior experience and family expectations. Harper drafted brochures, correspondence, and curriculum, while Mason provided financial backing and practical advice on everything from suitable living quarters to legal considerations. By spring, the first applications began to arrive. Daughters of neighboring ranchers, curious about the unusual program, girls from Austin and Dallas seeking escape from city constraints, even one shy inquiry from a Kentucky address that Harper recognized with a start as Samuel's hand. "He's asking on behalf of a friend's sister," she told Mason after reading the letter twice. "A girl named Emma Harrington, who he writes has always shown more interest in the stables than the parlor, much to her mother's dismay." "Will you accept her?" Mason asked. Harper considered the question carefully. Yes, she decided, but with clear communication about the distance and the program's focus on practical skills. If the family is expecting a finishing school with horses as a decorative accessory, they'll be disappointed. Samuel's response arrived promptly, confirming Emma's continued interest, despite, or perhaps because, of Harper's candid description of the program. "Her parents have agreed to a trial period of 3 months," he wrote. "I believe they hope the reality of ranch life will cure her of her unsuitable enthusiasms. I suspect they underestimate both Emma's determination and your ability to nurture it." As summer approached again, Harper found herself facing the unexpected nervousness of a teacher preparing for her first students. 5 young women had been accepted for the initial session. Emma from Kentucky, 2 daughters of neighboring ranchers, a banker's daughter from Austin, and a half-Mexican girl whose mother had worked as a cook on a cattle drive and saved for years to give her daughter opportunities she had never had. "What if I fail them?" Harper confessed her fears to Mason as they prepared the newly constructed dormitory, a simple but comfortable structure adjacent to the training barn. "What if I can't teach them what they need to know or protect them from the consequences of defying expectations?" "You won't be doing it alone," Mason reminded her, arranging fresh linens on the narrow beds. "And you're not responsible for the choices they make with the skills you teach them. All you can do is provide the opportunity, the knowledge, the example of what's possible. The rest is up to them." The wisdom in his words steadied her, as did his unwavering support for this new venture, despite the potential for controversy or criticism. Their partnership had evolved over the past year into something stronger and deeper than Harper had imagined possible. A true meeting of minds and hearts, a shared vision built on mutual respect and genuine love. The day the first students arrived dawned clear and bright, the Texas summer heat mitigated by a gentle breeze from the west. Harper stood on the porch of the main house, watching as the carriages and wagons approached, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Ready?" Mason asked, coming to stand beside her. Harper took a deep breath, drawing strength from his presence and from the knowledge of how far she had come, from frightened fugitive to respected horse trainer, from a girl desperate to escape to a woman creating something new and meaningful. "Ready," she confirmed, stepping forward to greet the future she had chosen, created and earned a future as wide open as the Texas horizon. 5 years later, as autumn painted the Texas plains in golds and russets, Harper stood at the entrance of her now thriving training facility. The structure had expanded from its modest beginnings to a comprehensive complex with spacious stalls, 2 roofed training rings, comfortable dormitories, and a central building that housed classrooms, offices, and living quarters for the permanent staff. In the main ring, 22 young women worked with horses under the guidance of instructors, most of them graduates of the program themselves, who had returned after gaining additional experience elsewhere. The Simmons School of Equestrian Arts, as it was formerly known, though many called it simply Harper's School, had become recognized throughout the territories and beyond for its unique approach to horsemanship and its equally distinctive perspective on women's capabilities. Not all graduates followed Harper's unconventional path. Some returned to traditional roles in their communities, bringing with them new skills and quiet confidence that subtly shifted perceptions of what women could contribute. Others pursued careers in breeding training or competitive riding, breaking barriers and challenging assumptions wherever they went. A few, like Harper herself, found ways to create entirely new paths that defied easy categorization. Emma Harrington, that first tentative applicant from Kentucky, had stayed after her initial 3 months, completing the full year-long program, despite her parents' increasingly urgent letters suggesting she return home. Now, she managed her family's stables back in Kentucky, having negotiated a position that acknowledged her expertise while allowing her to remain within the bounds of social acceptability. Her letters to Harper were filled with stories of small victories and gradual changes, girls being allowed to ride astride rather than side-saddle, breeding decisions based on her recommendations rather than her father's preferences, quiet adjustments that expanded what was possible without directly challenging the existing order. Other graduates had been bolder in their choices. Grace Thompson had established her own training business in California, specializing in horses for women riders with an emphasis on safety and control. Rebecca Chen had returned to Boston with her hard-earned skills, securing a position at a prestigious riding academy where she gradually introduced techniques and approaches learned at Harper's school. Sarah Two Rivers, whose mixed Comanche and white heritage had often made her an outsider in both communities, now worked alongside Harper as head trainer, her extraordinary connection with horses making her a natural teacher despite her initial shyness with people. "You've built something remarkable here," Mason's voice came from behind her. Harper turned to face her husband, his familiar features weathered by sun and time, but still handsome, still capable of sending a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. Their partnership had deepened over the years, evolving into something that seemed to Harper like a rare and perfect balance, each supporting the other's endeavors while maintaining their individual passions and perspectives. "We've built it," Harper corrected, taking his hand. "I couldn't have done this without your support. The vision was yours. I merely provided the land. And financial backing and legal assistance and connections to every family who sent their difficult daughters here instead of locking them away in asylums or forcing them into unwanted marriages." Harper smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "I'd say your contribution was substantial." Mason chuckled, still uncomfortable with praise even after years of marriage. "I think your next student has arrived," he said, nodding toward the road, where a dust cloud announced an approaching buggy. Harper shaded her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "That would be the Montgomery girl from San Antonio. Father's a banker, mother's from old Southern money. They wrote that she's unnaturally interested in mathematics and refuses suitable suitors. Sounds promising. Another lost cause for your collection." "Not lost," Harper corrected firmly. "Just not yet found by the right people." As she walked toward the gate to greet her newest student, Harper felt a fullness in her heart that still sometimes surprised her. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. There had been setbacks, community resistance, parents withdrawing students when they realized the true nature of the program, even a brief but intense campaign by a local minister denouncing the school as unnatural and dangerous to proper femininity. Yet, For each obstacle, there had been unexpected allies. The banker's wife who defended the school's financial contributions to the area, the mother who spoke publicly about her daughter's newfound confidence and purpose, the local newspaper editor who published a surprisingly supportive editorial about forward-thinking opportunities for the modern young woman. Samuel had finally visited 2 years earlier, bringing with him not only Emma's younger sister as a prospective student, but also news that their father had softened further with age and ill health. "He keeps your letter on his desk," Samuel had reported. "The one where you wrote about the school's first successful year. He hasn't responded, but he reads it often." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a form of acknowledgement, perhaps the most Robert Wells was capable of offering. Harper had made her peace with that understanding that some bridges once burned could never be fully rebuilt, only acknowledged from opposite shores. Behind her, she could hear Mason calling instructions to Frank about the new foal. Ahead, the nervous young woman in the approaching buggy was about to discover possibilities she had never imagined. And all around, the Texas sky stretched limitless and free, much like the future Harper had claimed for herself. It wasn't a perfect world, not yet. There were still battles to be fought, minds to be changed, barriers to be broken. But it was a beginning. A declaration that there could be more than one way to be a woman, more than one path to a meaningful life. That some truths, once accepted, could transform not just a single life, but the world around it. Harper Wells Simmons straightened her shoulders and walked forward to meet the future she had chosen, created and earned a future as wide open as the Texas horizon.